humanity had managed to weave a complex web of alliances in the galaxy, navigating a treacherous landscape of politics and power. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always clean, but Earth had carved out a niche as a dependable partner to several key species. These alliances were built on mutual benefit, trade routes that enriched both sides, technological exchanges that pushed the boundaries of progress, and military agreements that ensured security in an increasingly volatile galaxy. Despite being relatively new to the interstellar stage, humanity had proven itself a capable ally, earning respect where skepticism once prevailed. Earth's leaders were pragmatic. They knew that in a galaxy filled with species far older and more powerful, humanity couldn't afford to rely solely on its military or technological prowess. Diplomacy was the key. The alliances were forged through a careful balance of cooperation and subtle negotiation, with each species involved gaining something valuable from their relationship with humanity. It was this shared interest that had kept the peace, though everyone knew that such peace was fragile. Beneath the surface, tensions always simmered, old rivalries between species, territorial disputes, and the constant fear of an arms race kept the galaxy on edge. For now, however, things seemed stable. Humanity had made key allies, most notably with the Christi, an advanced species known for their mastery of energy manipulation, and the Talvari, whose defensive technologies had been instrumental in helping Earth's early space endeavors. These species, while not the largest powers in the galaxy, held significant influence, and their alliances with humanity ensured that Earth had a seat at the table during major galactic discussions. Earth's position wasn't one of dominance, but of balance, a mediator among powers that trusted them enough to maintain neutrality, if only for the sake of their mutual interests. But peace in the galaxy was always tentative, and the alliances humanity had built were no exception. Hidden beneath the diplomatic smiles and shared prosperity were deep-seated suspicions, not only between humanity's allies but also toward humanity itself. The Christi, for all their technological superiority, resented the Talvari's growing influence. The Talvari, meanwhile, were wary of the Christi's dominance in energy-based weapons. Humanity, playing the role of mediator, was the only thing keeping these tensions from boiling over. And while the council meetings were often cordial on the surface, there was always a hint of rivalry, a tension that Earth's diplomats were keenly aware of. It was during one of these council meetings that the first seeds of doubt were planted. Earth's representatives had called for the meeting to discuss a new trade route that would benefit not only humanity, but all allied species, ensuring faster travel and trade between sectors. The idea was sound, the benefits clear, but the undercurrents of mistrust began to ripple almost immediately. The Talvari ambassador, usually reserved and pragmatic, raised concerns about the proposed route cutting through Christi territory, suggesting that it gave the Christi an unfair advantage in controlling key resources. The Christi, naturally, took offense, accusing the Talvari of undermining a deal that would benefit everyone. Humanity's representatives tried to mediate, offering compromises and assurances that the trade route would be monitored to ensure fairness, but the damage had already begun. The Christi and Talvari, long suspicious of each other, now found reasons to question humanity's role in the proposal. Was Earth favoring the Christi in some secret bid for more power? Or were the Talvari being manipulated into pushing an agenda that benefited humanity at the cost of the alliance? The once stable foundation of trust between these species began to crack, and humanity found itself in the uncomfortable position of being at the center of the brewing conflict. What Earth's leaders didn't realize at the time was that this seemingly minor disagreement over trade routes would be the spark that ignited a larger conflict. The Christi and Talvari had always viewed each other with suspicion, but now those suspicions turned toward humanity. Whispers began circulating among the council, rumors that Earth was using its diplomatic position to play both sides, that humanity had always intended to sow discord between its allies to emerge as the sole power in the alliance. These rumors, unfounded as they were, spread quickly, fueled by the natural paranoia that had existed among these species for generations. The tension escalated in the days following the meeting. The Talvari pulled back from joint military exercises with the Christi, citing a need to reassess the balance of power within the alliance. The Christi, not to be outdone, quietly increased their patrols along the proposed trade route, sparking further concern among the Tal'Vari. Each move was interpreted as a strategic threat, and each attempt by humanity to calm the situation only deepened the suspicions. What had started as a simple trade negotiation was now spiraling into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Humanity's leaders were taken aback by how quickly the situation had deteriorated. Earth had always seen itself as the mediator, the peacekeeper, in these fragile alliances. They had underestimated how quickly the distrust between their allies could turn inward, how old rivalries could flare up with the slightest provocation. And now, humanity was being seen not as the neutral party holding things together, but as the catalyst for the unraveling. Behind closed doors, the Christi accused humanity of plotting to control the galaxy's most valuable trade routes, positioning themselves as the primary beneficiaries of any future deals. The Tal'Vari, meanwhile, grew more convinced that Earth was aiding the Christi in consolidating power, using the alliance as a cover for their true ambitions. In truth, Earth had no such designs, but perception had already begun to shift. No matter what humanity said or did now, the narrative was slipping out of their control. The fragility of galactic alliances had always been understood, but humanity had hoped that rational diplomacy and mutual benefit would hold things together. They had overestimated the strength of those bonds and underestimated the deeply ingrained rivalries among their allies. What had taken years to build, trust, cooperation, and a shared vision of progress, was now crumbling in the span of days. The old alliances, so carefully crafted, were unraveling faster than anyone could have anticipated, and the more humanity tried to intervene, the worse it seemed to get. The irony wasn't lost on Earth's leadership. They had entered the galactic stage with the hope of fostering peace, of building alliances that could stand the test of time. But now, they were watching those very alliances fracture, and for the first time, humanity wasn't seen as a stabilizing force, but as the very reason for the conflict. What had once been their greatest diplomatic achievement was quickly becoming their biggest liability. And in just a few days, allies who had stood beside humanity were starting to see Earth not as a friend, but as a threat. The first cracks in humanity's alliances had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but now the fractures were widening. What had started as minor misunderstandings and quiet suspicions was spiraling into a full-blown diplomatic disaster. At the heart of the issue were the miscommunications, simple, innocent gestures that were twisted by paranoia and manipulated by political opportunists looking for any excuse to shift the balance of power. It began with a poorly timed message from Earth to the Christi leadership, a simple diplomatic dispatch meant to clarify the situation surrounding the new trade route proposal. The message, translated into the Christi's complex language, had a subtle connotation that human diplomats hadn't foreseen, a phrase that, while neutral in Earth's languages, carried a sharp implication of dominance when interpreted by Christi cultural standards. The Christi Council, already suspicious, interpreted this as a veiled threat from humanity, an assertion of control over the negotiations. The Christi, now convinced that humanity was attempting to manipulate them, responded with an icy formality, reinforcing their own borders and withdrawing their economic cooperation with Earth. This sudden move left the human diplomats scrambling to recover, as they hadn't intended to signal aggression. A series of rushed clarifications followed, but each attempt to explain only deepened the misunderstanding. Earth's reassurances were seen as backpedaling, and every gesture was now perceived as an effort to cover up hidden motives. At the same time, the Tal'Vari, sensing the growing tension between humanity and the Christi, saw an opportunity. They began quietly spreading rumors among the council members, suggesting that Earth had always intended to pit the two species against each other. The Tal'Vari had long harbored concerns over Earth's influence within the Council, and now they were using the escalating situation to their advantage. They whispered that humanity had played the long game, manipulating alliances to rise as the central power, intending to divide and conquer their so-called allies. The Tal'Vari's rumors spread quickly, fueled by the existing doubts that had taken root in the Council. Other species began to question humanity's role in the broader galactic politics. Some even suggested that the trade route proposal had been a deliberate trap, designed to incite conflict between the Christi and Tal'Vari while humanity emerged unscathed. Suddenly, Earth's intentions, once viewed as diplomatic and benign, were being recast as cunning and deceptive. Human diplomats, unaware of the full extent of the rumors, continued to push for resolutions, organizing meetings and sending formal communiques in an attempt to salvage the situation. But by now, the damage had been done. Every move they made was interpreted through the lens of suspicion. When Earth offered compromises to the Christi on resource-sharing agreements, it was seen as an attempt to placate them, while behind the scenes, humanity was supposedly consolidating its power. When Earth reached out to the Tal'Vari to address their concerns, it was seen as a sign of weakness, a desperate attempt to salvage an alliance already lost. In just days, what had once been stable relationships now teetered on the edge of collapse. Allies who had previously trusted Earth now saw their every action as part of a larger, darker scheme. The Christi, long proud of their independence, grew increasingly hostile, accusing humanity of playing puppet master behind the scenes. They quietly began rearming, bolstering their defenses, and pulling their diplomats out of cooperative trade negotiations. Meanwhile, the Tal'Vari, ever opportunistic, seized upon the tension to position themselves as the protectors of galactic interests, casting doubt on humanity's leadership in subtle but effective ways. The galaxy, once relatively stable with Earth playing a central role in maintaining peace, was now becoming a place of distrust and strategic repositioning. Each species began to solidify their defenses, no longer sharing technological advancements or military intelligence with Earth. Trade agreements were suspended, joint military drills were cancelled, and diplomatic channels that had once been open and friendly were now flooded with terse formalities and layers of bureaucratic barriers. Earth's leadership, still reeling from the rapid turn of events, found itself paralyzed. They had built their foreign policy on trust, on the belief that rational negotiation and mutual benefit would hold the alliance together. Now, they were facing a harsh reality. Their allies no longer believed in that trust. Diplomacy had failed, and the galaxy was rapidly polarizing into factions, some quietly withdrawing support, others openly questioning humanity's leadership. Even those species who had remained neutral or uninvolved were beginning to distance themselves, not wanting to be caught in what they increasingly saw as an inevitable fallout. Humanity's greatest mistake wasn't in making the initial missteps, but in underestimating the speed with which those missteps could spiral out of control. They had believed that time and reason would mend the rifts, that their alliances were strong enough to withstand these challenges. But as the days passed, it became clear that trust, once broken, was almost impossible to restore. Each attempt at reconciliation only seemed to further alienate their former allies, feeding the narrative that Earth was manipulating events for its own benefit. The galaxy, which had once seemed so vast and full of opportunity for cooperation, now felt smaller and more dangerous. Humanity was isolated, and while no one had declared open hostility yet, the signs were clear. Earth's fleets were being tracked more closely, their movements analyzed for any hint of aggression. Diplomats reported being treated with cold indifference, even hostility, by councils that had once welcomed them as partners. Where humanity had once played a key role in shaping galactic policy, they were now being edged out, viewed with suspicion and even contempt. Allies who had stood by humanity's side for years now questioned their motives, their actions, and their very place in the galaxy. And what made it worse was that there was no clear path forward. The miscommunications, once set in motion, were nearly impossible to undo. Rumors, once spread, could not be easily retracted. The Tal'Vari's subtle manipulations and the Christi's growing paranoia had taken root, and humanity's efforts to right the ship only made the waters more turbulent. What had been built over years of careful diplomacy was now unraveling in days, and Earth, once a respected voice of reason and balance, was becoming a symbol of betrayal and deceit in the eyes of their former allies. The weight of the galaxy's shifting alliances pressed down on humanity's leaders, who were left with a grim realization: they had lost control of the narrative, and their place in the galaxy was now in jeopardy. What had once been a thriving network of alliances was disintegrating, and Earth's role in the galaxy was more uncertain than ever before. In the aftermath of the diplomatic collapse, humanity's former allies didn't just distance themselves, they began actively preparing for what many of them now saw as an inevitable conflict. The Christi, having fully convinced themselves that humanity had manipulated them from the start, began fortifying their borders, withdrawing their ambassadors, and moving fleets into defensive positions. Their distrust had escalated into outright hostility, and while they hadn't made any public declaration of war, their actions left no room for doubt. For them, the alliance was not merely broken, it was shattered, and Earth was now considered a direct threat. The Tal'Vari, ever calculating, played a more subtle game. They had used the chaos to their advantage, maneuvering diplomatically to align themselves with other species, spreading the narrative that humanity had betrayed the trust of its allies. While they were not as openly aggressive as the Christi, they quietly severed trade agreements with Earth, suspended joint research programs, and began forming secret alliances with smaller factions, positioning themselves as the leaders of a new coalition that could oppose humanity if needed. Meanwhile, Earth's leaders were left scrambling to understand how things had unraveled so quickly. Attempts to reach out to the Christi were ignored, and Tal'Vari diplomats offered only vague, dismissive responses. Humanity had gone from being a central player in galactic politics to being isolated, viewed with suspicion and fear. The diplomatic channels that had once flowed freely were now frozen, clogged with bureaucracy and evasions. Human representatives who had once been welcomed into high-level discussions now found themselves waiting for weeks to get even the most basic responses. And when those responses came, they were filled with veiled accusations and thinly disguised disdain. The situation was deteriorating at a pace that stunned Earth's leadership. Former allies weren't just ignoring humanity. They were starting to take concrete actions that bordered on aggressive. Human colonies near Christi and Tal'Vari space reported increased surveillance by alien patrols. Where once there had been cooperation, there was now a growing sense of threat. Earth's merchant ships were being stopped and inspected under flimsy pretexts, their cargo searched for any sign of what the Christi and Tal'Vari referred to as potential threats to galactic security. It was clear that the trust that had once existed was now replaced by paranoia. The Christi took it a step further. In a sudden and alarming move, they began massing fleets along their border with human space. What had been a strategic defensive posture now became an outright provocation. Earth's intelligence networks reported increased military activity within Christi territory, and there were whispers of war preparations. It was as if the Christi were gearing up for a conflict they believed was inevitable, a conflict that, in their minds, humanity had already initiated through deception and betrayal. Earth's military commanders, who had been on high alert since the diplomatic breakdown, began to push for stronger defensive measures. They understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone. The Christi were not just posturing, they were preparing for the worst, and humanity needed to be ready. Earth began mobilizing its fleets, reinforcing its outer colonies, and increasing its surveillance of Christi and Tal'Vari space. The tone had shifted from one of cautious diplomacy to one of grim readiness. Everyone knew that the fragile peace that had once held the galaxy together was now in tatters. Despite these preparations, Earth's leaders were still reluctant to fully accept the reality that their former allies were now potential enemies. There was a hope, however faint, that a diplomatic solution could still be found, that the alliances could be salvaged before things spiraled completely out of control. But that hope was quickly fading. Every attempt to re-establish dialogue was met with silence or, worse, thinly veiled hostility. The Christi had made up their minds, and the Tal'Vari were too busy solidifying their new alliances to care about humanity's attempts at reconciliation. The final blow came when the Christi, without warning, seized one of humanity's smaller outposts near the border. They claimed it was an act of preemptive defense, accusing Earth of using the outpost to stage potential attacks against Christi space. The claim was ludicrous. Earth had no such plans, but the act itself was a clear signal. The Christi were no longer content with defensive posturing. They were preparing for conflict. And they were doing so under the justification that humanity was the aggressor. This move stunned Earth's leadership. The seizure of the outpost was an open violation of the peace that had existed between the two species, and it was clear that the Christi were pushing toward war. Earth was now faced with a choice: retaliate and risk further escalation, or stand down and allow their former ally to continue encroaching on their territory. Either option carried enormous risks. Retaliation could lead to full-scale war, but doing nothing would signal weakness, encouraging the Christi and others to take even more aggressive actions. The Tal'Vari, predictably, remained on the sidelines, officially condemning the Christi's actions but taking no real steps to de-escalate the situation. They were content to watch the two former allies inch closer to conflict, ready to swoop in and consolidate their position as the dominant power once the dust settled. Earth's leaders saw through their game, but there was little they could do to counter it. The galaxy had turned its back on them, and humanity was now standing alone. In the following days, tensions escalated further. Earth's fleets were moved into defensive positions, but they were under strict orders not to engage unless directly attacked. The Christi, emboldened by their seizure of the outposts, began to probe further, sending reconnaissance missions deeper into human space, testing Earth's resolve. The standoff was tense, with both sides on the brink of conflict, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Meanwhile, Earth's population was growing increasingly restless. News of the diplomatic breakdown and the Christi's actions spread quickly, and there was a growing sense of unease. People who had once believed in the strength of humanity's alliances now saw those same alliances as a source of danger. There was talk of preparing for war, of mobilizing even more resources to defend against what many saw as an inevitable invasion. Within the halls of power on Earth, the mood had shifted completely. The optimism that had once driven their foreign policy was gone, replaced by a cold pragmatism. They knew now that their former allies were not coming back, and that humanity had become the villain in a story they hadn't even realized was being written. What had begun as a diplomatic misunderstanding had snowballed into something far more dangerous, and now humanity was on the verge of facing a war they had never intended to start. All of this had unfolded in just a matter of days. Earth had gone from being a respected player on the galactic stage to being isolated, mistrusted, and actively threatened. Their former allies had turned against them, and the galaxy had become a far more hostile place. The irony was bitter. The alliances that humanity had worked so hard to build had collapsed, and in doing so, had created enemies from friends faster than anyone could have imagined. The galaxy had shifted. What had once been a network of alliances forged by shared goals and cooperation was now a precarious and dangerous place for humanity. The diplomatic landscape that had taken years to build had collapsed in days, and Earth found itself standing on the edge of a conflict that seemed both inevitable and incomprehensible. The speed at which everything had unraveled left no time for reflection, only reaction. Now, as the Christi massed their fleets and the Tal'Vari solidified their new alliances, humanity had to confront the reality that their former allies had become enemies. The seizure of the outposts by the Christi was not just a symbolic act. It was a clear declaration that they no longer trusted humanity, no longer saw Earth as a partner but as a potential adversary. In the eyes of the Christi, humanity's diplomatic efforts were not enough to undo the damage. They believed that humanity had deceived them all along, and every step they took now was seen through a lens of suspicion and paranoia. The galaxy, which had once welcomed Earth's rise, now watched as tensions reached a boiling point. Earth's leadership had no illusions about the gravity of the situation. Diplomatic solutions were no longer viable, not with the Christi treating every attempt at dialogue as further manipulation. Humanity had tried to hold on to the hope that some thread of trust remained, but that hope was gone. The Christi had made their stance clear. They were prepared for conflict, and Earth had to decide whether to respond in kind or risk being overrun. But Earth wasn't ready to give up. Even as their fleets moved into defensive positions, their leaders continued to explore every possible avenue to avoid open war. Messages were sent, not just to the Christi, but to other species across the galaxy, neutral parties who might still be willing to intervene or at least mediate before things spiraled further out of control. Yet those messages received little more than polite acknowledgments, often accompanied by warnings to prepare for the worst. The galaxy, once so eager to engage with humanity, now seemed content to watch from a distance as the crisis unfolded. The Tal'Vari, meanwhile, played their cards carefully. They hadn't yet taken any direct action against humanity, but their silence was deafening. Earth had come to understand that the Tal'Vari were more than happy to let the Christi and humanity clash. They would wait until the conflict weakened both sides, then sweep in to consolidate their power. It was a classic move, one that humanity had seen before in the long history of galactic politics, but knowing it was happening didn't make it any easier to stop. Earth's leadership faced mounting pressure from within. The population, now fully aware of the growing threats at their borders, was demanding action. There was talk of war, of preemptive strikes, of not waiting for the Christi to dictate the terms of the conflict. The military commanders, while disciplined and patient, were beginning to question how long they could hold the line without losing the initiative. It was a tense, uneasy time, and everyone knew that one wrong move could lead to a cascade of events that would be impossible to control. The Christi didn't wait for Earth to act. In a brazen move, they launched another incursion into human space, this time, not a small outpost but a key trade route that had been a lifeline for Earth's colonies on the frontier. The attack wasn't devastating in terms of losses, but its significance was clear. The Christi were escalating, and they were doing so with the intent to provoke a full-scale conflict. Their message was unmistakable. They were ready for war, and they no longer believed in the possibility of peace with humanity. Earth's leaders held an emergency council to discuss their options. The decision was not easy. To strike back would mean confirming the Christi's fears and likely triggering a war that could engulf the entire region of space. But to do nothing would be seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation for further aggression, not just from the Christi, but from others who were watching, waiting for humanity to falter. In the end, Earth made its choice. They would defend themselves, but they would not be the aggressors. Orders were given to reinforce the trade routes, to secure their borders, and to prepare for any further attacks. The message to the galaxy was clear: humanity was not seeking war, but they would not be pushed any further. It was a delicate line to walk, and one that could collapse at any moment, but it was the only path Earth could see that didn't end in complete destruction. As the Christi continued to posture, Earth's fleets maintained their positions, fully aware that the next move could be decisive. Tensions between the two powers reached a breaking point, and it seemed that the slightest misstep would send them both over the edge. The galaxy watched, holding its breath, as humanity and the Christi stood on the precipice of war. In the midst of this chaos, the Tal'Vari quietly expanded their influence. They began forging new alliances with smaller species, promising protection and security in exchange for loyalty. They positioned themselves as the stabilizing force in a galaxy that was rapidly descending into chaos, all while ensuring that they wouldn't be drawn into the conflict between Earth and the Christi. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering, and humanity could only watch as their former ally-turned-competitor used the situation to its advantage. The bitter irony was undeniable. In a matter of days, Earth had gone from being a respected partner in a web of alliances to a pariah on the brink of war. The very trust they had worked so hard to build had been twisted into suspicion and betrayal. Their allies had become enemies, and their enemies were now positioning themselves to dominate the galaxy in the wake of the conflict. It was a devastating reversal, one that no one had seen coming, and one that Earth's leaders could do little to reverse. Despite everything, humanity wasn't defeated. They had faced worse odds before, and they had always found a way to adapt, to survive, and to emerge stronger. The alliances may have crumbled, but Earth still had its own resources, its own strengths. The galaxy may have turned against them, but humanity had learned long ago how to persevere in the face of overwhelming adversity. The story of how humanity created enemies from allies in just days would be remembered for generations. It would serve as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust, the dangers of miscommunication, and the speed at which alliances can unravel. But it would also be a story about resilience, about standing firm in the face of impossible odds, and about the unbreakable will to survive, even when the entire galaxy seems determined to see you fall.